They say when blood spills on Louisiana soil, the earth remembers forever. Tonight, the Red River plantation would learn that some secrets are worth killing for. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change everything you think you know about love, power, and survival in 1833. The morning mist clung to the Red River like a shroud when the news spread through Bellefonte Plantation, faster than wildfire through dry cotton. Nathaniel Burke was dead. The 25-year-old overseer who'd arrived from Tennessee 3 years ago, with his leather whip and nervous smile, lay motionless in the grain cellar, his skull cracked open like a melon dropped from heaven. Master Edmond Rousseau stood over the body, his face pale as morning fog. "Fetch the sheriff," he barked to his houseboy, then paused, studying the scene. No signs of struggle, no robbery. Just Nathaniel's lifeless form sprawled between sacks of corn, his eyes staring at nothing. In the kitchen quarters, 63-year-old Amélia continued kneading bread dough with steady hands, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. She'd been awake since before dawn, as always, preparing breakfast for the big house. The other slaves whispered around her. Who could have done such a thing? Young Master Nathaniel was firm but fair. Wasn't he? Amélia said nothing. She never said much of anything. "Hold, Amélia," called Rousseau from the doorway, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. "You were in the kitchen all night?" "Yes, master," she replied without looking up, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "Been baking since 4 o'clock. Bread don't make itself." Rousseau studied her weathered face, searching for something he couldn't name. Amélia had been on this plantation longer than anyone, bought as a child when his father still ran things. She was invisible furniture now, reliable as sunrise, bent by time and labor, into something that barely registered as human in his mind. "Anyone else come through here? Any of the field hands?" "No, master. Just me and the ovens." He nodded curtly and left. Amelia's hands never stopped working the dough, but her mind raced back to 3 hours earlier, when she'd stood in that same cellar with Nathaniel's blood on her apron and a choice that would haunt her forever. The investigation began immediately. Sheriff Boudreau arrived by noon, a thick-set Creole man who'd seen enough plantation violence to know that slaves killing overseers meant one thing: uprising. The very word sent chills through every white household from New Orleans to Shreveport. "Line them up," Boudreau ordered. Every last one. 43 enslaved souls stood in the blazing Louisiana sun while the sheriff examined their hands, their clothes, their faces for signs of guilt. The men who worked closest to Nathaniel, Samuel, who drove the cotton wagon, Moses, who tended the horses, young Jacob, who'd been whipped just last week for talking back, all trembled under scrutiny. But it was Amélia who caught the sheriff's attention, not for what she showed, but for what she didn't. While others fidgeted and sweated, she stood perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the cotton fields. "You," Boudreau pointed at her. "Step forward." Amélia moved slowly, her joints protesting each step. At 63, she was ancient by plantation standards, her body a map of decades spent in service. Her hair, now completely gray, was hidden beneath a faded head wrap. Her hands, scarred from countless burns and cuts, hung at her sides. "What's your name?" "Amélia, sir." "How long you been here?" "Since I was 7, sir. Master's daddy bought me in New Orleans." 56 years. Boudreau calculated quickly. This woman had seen everything: births, deaths, beatings, sales. She was a living archive of plantation secrets. "You know anything about what happened to Overseer Burke?" "No, sir. I mind my own business." The sheriff circled her like a hawk studying prey. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't place it. In his experience, guilty slaves either broke down immediately or overcompensated with elaborate stories. Amélia did neither. She simply existed, patient as stone. "Where were you last night between midnight and dawn?" "In the kitchen, sir, baking bread, preparing breakfast. Same as every night." "Anyone see you?" "No, sir. I work alone." That was the problem, Boudreau realized. The kitchen was isolated from the slave quarters, positioned between the big house and the work buildings. If someone wanted to move unseen through the plantation, the kitchen would be the perfect cover. But this was Amélia. Old, bent, barely strong enough to lift a cast-iron pot. The idea of her overpowering a healthy young man seemed absurd. As the afternoon wore on, the sheriff questioned everyone twice, then 3 times. Stories remained consistent. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had heard screams or sounds of struggle. Nathaniel Burke had simply vanished from the world of the living sometime between midnight and dawn, as quietly as morning mist. By evening, Boudreau was frustrated. Master Rousseau was growing impatient. The slaves were terrified, knowing that unsolved murders meant collective punishment. Someone would pay, guilty or not. In her small cabin behind the kitchen, Amélia sat on her narrow bed and stared at her hands. These hands that had kneaded 10,000 loaves of bread, that had birthed babies and closed the eyes of the dead, that had endured 56 years of bondage without breaking. These hands that just hours ago had held a cast-iron skillet with enough force to crack a man's skull. She thought about Nathaniel's final words, whispered in the darkness of the grain cellar. "Come with me, Amélia. We can be free together." The desperate plea of a young man who'd never understood that freedom wasn't something you could steal in the night. Freedom was something you earned, drop by drop, through decades of survival. Outside her window, she could hear the other slaves whispering prayers and fears. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more suspicion, more danger. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Amélia slept without the weight of Nathaniel Burke's expectations pressing down on her chest. The Red River flowed past the plantation in the darkness, carrying secrets toward the Gulf of Mexico. Some secrets Amélia knew were meant to be buried. Others were meant to be carried away by water, dissolved into something larger than any one person's pain. But the most dangerous secrets, the ones that could destroy everything, those had to be protected with blood. 3 years earlier, when Nathaniel Burke first arrived at Bellefonte Plantation, nobody could have predicted that his presence would lead to murder. But some arrangements are doomed from the moment they begin. Keep watching, because the truth about how this deadly romance started will shock you. Summer 1830. Nathaniel Burke stepped off the riverboat at Bellefonte Landing with nothing but a worn leather satchel and a letter of recommendation from his uncle in Tennessee. At 22, he was young for an overseer position, but Master Rousseau needed someone desperate enough to work for low wages and isolated enough to stay loyal. The previous overseer, a brutal man named Crenshaw, had been found floating face down in the Red River after the slaves staged a work slowdown that cost Rousseau nearly 1/4 of his cotton crop. No one spoke of what really happened to Crenshaw, but the message was clear. Some forms of cruelty had consequences. Nathaniel's first week was a disaster. The field hands tested him constantly, working slowly when he wasn't watching, misunderstanding his orders, breaking tools with suspicious frequency. He was too young, too uncertain, too obviously overwhelmed by the responsibility of controlling 43 human beings who had every reason to hate him. It was Amélia who saved him, though neither of them understood it at the time. She'd been watching from the kitchen window as Nathaniel struggled to organize the morning work assignments. The slaves stood in loose groups, their body language radiating subtle defiance. Samuel, the wagon driver, kept glancing toward the river. Moses, who tended the horses, had his arms crossed in a way that suggested he was calculating something. Young Jacob was practically vibrating with suppressed anger. Amélia had seen this before. The slaves were deciding whether to break this new overseer quickly or let him break himself slowly. Either way, people would suffer. When overseers failed, masters brought in replacements who were twice as harsh. She made a choice that would haunt her for 3 years. Walking across the yard with a pitcher of water and tin cups, Amélia approached the group. "Mornin', Master Burke," she said quietly. "Thought you might be thirsty." The simple gesture shifted everything. By acknowledging Nathaniel's authority publicly, by showing deference, Amélia gave the other slaves permission to do the same. It was a survival strategy she'd perfected over decades, managing white expectations to protect her people from worse alternatives. Nathaniel accepted the water gratefully, not understanding the complex social negotiation that had just occurred. "Thank you, Amélia." "You're welcome, sir." She turned to go, then paused. "Master Burke, the field hands work best when they understand what's expected. Clear instructions, consistent rules. They're good people. Just need to know where they stand." It was the longest speech anyone had heard from Amélia in years. Nathaniel nodded, studying her weathered face. There was intelligence in her dark eyes, a depth of understanding that surprised him. Over the following weeks, Amélia became Nathaniel's unofficial advisor. She never approached him directly, never overstepped the boundaries of her position, but she found subtle ways to guide him. A word here about which slaves worked well together. A suggestion there about timing the cotton picking to avoid the worst heat. Small interventions that made his job manageable and kept her people safe. Nathaniel began seeking her out, initially for practical advice, then for something harder to define. Amélia had a way of listening that made him feel heard. In Tennessee, he'd been the youngest son of a failed farmer, invisible and unwanted. Here, this elderly slave woman treated his words as if they mattered. The first time he touched her was an accident. Late one evening in October, Nathaniel had come to the kitchen to discuss the next day's work assignments. Amélia was cleaning up after dinner, her movements slow and careful in the lamplight. As she reached for a high shelf, she stumbled slightly, and Nathaniel instinctively caught her arm. For a moment, they stood frozen. Her skin was warm beneath his fingers, and he could smell the faint scent of cornbread and wood smoke that always surrounded her. Amelia's eyes met his, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or acknowledgement of a boundary that had just been crossed. "Thank you, Master Burke," she whispered. He released her arm but didn't step away. "Are you hurt?" "No, sir, just tired." They stood in the golden circle of lamplight, two people separated by race, age, and the entire structure of Southern society, yet connected by something neither could name. Nathaniel was 22 and lonely. Amélia was 60 and had learned to find comfort wherever it appeared. "Amélia," he said softly, "you don't have to call me master when we're alone." It was a dangerous thing to say. Slaves had been whipped for less. But Amélia recognized the loneliness in his voice, the desperate need for human connection that transcended the roles they were forced to play. "What should I call you?" she asked. "Nathaniel, just Nathaniel." The arrangement began that night, though neither of them called it that. Nathaniel started visiting the kitchen more frequently, always with legitimate reasons, discussing work, checking supplies, ensuring security. But the conversations grew longer, more personal. He told her about his childhood in Tennessee, his father's drinking, his mother's early death. She listened without judgment, offering the kind of maternal comfort he'd never received. Amélia, for her part, found herself looking forward to these visits. After decades of being invisible, of swallowing her thoughts and opinions to survive, she discovered the intoxicating pleasure of being heard. Nathaniel asked for her advice and actually listened to her answers. He treated her as if her mind mattered, as if her experiences had value. The physical intimacy developed gradually, almost inevitably. A hand lingering on a shoulder, fingers brushing while passing a cup of coffee. The night Nathaniel found Amélia crying over a letter that brought news of her youngest son's sale to a plantation in Mississippi, he held her while she wept, and neither of them pretended it was appropriate. By winter, they had established a routine. After the other slaves were asleep, Nathaniel would slip into the kitchen, where Amélia waited with coffee and whatever food she'd managed to save from dinner. They would talk quietly by the dying fire, sharing stories and silences that felt more intimate than anything either had experienced. The first time they made love, it was Amélia who initiated it. She was 60 years old and had borne 7 children to 5 different fathers, none by choice. But with Nathaniel, for the first time in her life, she chose. The power in that choice was intoxicating, even as she understood its terrible danger. Nathaniel was gentle with her, reverent almost, as if he couldn't quite believe this was happening. Afterward, as they lay together on the narrow cot in the storage room behind the kitchen, he whispered promises about the future. Someday, he said, things would be different. Someday, they could be together openly. Amélia said nothing, but she thought about her children and grandchildren scattered across Louisiana and Mississippi, about the scars on her back from whippings she'd received for smaller transgressions than this, about the fundamental impossibility of the future Nathaniel imagined. She loved him. That was the terrible truth she carried through the winter of 1830 and into the spring of 1831. She loved his youth, his optimism, his genuine belief that love could transcend the barriers between them. But she also knew that love, in their world, was a luxury that could cost everything. The arrangement continued for 3 years, hidden in the spaces between official plantation life. 3 years of stolen moments whispered conversations, and the gradual realization that what had begun as mutual comfort was becoming something far more dangerous. By 1833, Nathaniel's promises about the future had become demands. By 1833, Amelia's choice to love him had become a trap that threatened not just her own life, but the lives of everyone she'd spent 60 years protecting. Some arrangements, she would learn, can only end in blood. By 1833, the secret romance between Amélia and Nathaniel had become a powder keg waiting to explode. But it wasn't love that would destroy them. It was the arrival of someone who threatened to expose everything. Don't look away now, because what happens next will show you how quickly paradise can become hell. The trouble began with Master Rousseau's nephew, Philippe Dufresne, who arrived from New Orleans in March 1833 with expensive clothes, calculating eyes, and very specific ideas about how plantations should be run. Philippe was everything Nathaniel wasn't: sophisticated, educated, and utterly without sentiment when it came to managing enslaved labor. At 28, he'd already made a fortune in the slave trade, buying and selling human beings with the same cold efficiency other men applied to cotton or sugar. "Uncle Edmund," Philippe said on his first morning at Bellefonte, standing on the gallery with his coffee and surveying the fields, "your operation is quaint but hardly profitable." Master Rousseau bristled. "We've had good years. The cotton could yield twice as much with proper management." Philippe's gaze fixed on Nathaniel, who was organizing the morning work assignments with his usual mixture of firmness and restraint. "Your overseer seems rather gentle with the stock." Stock. The word hit Nathaniel like a slap. In 3 years at Bellefonte, he'd learned to see the enslaved people as individuals. Samuel with his skill for fixing broken wagon wheels, Moses with his way of calming spooked horses, young Jacob with his quick mind and quicker temper. Philippe saw only inventory. "Nathaniel's done well enough," Rousseau said defensively, though doubt crept into his voice. His nephew's success in New Orleans was undeniable, and Bellefonte's profits had been declining. "Has he?" Philippe pulled out a leather-bound ledger. "I've been reviewing your books. Production is down 15% from 5 years ago, despite maintaining the same number of workers. Either your land is failing, or your management is." Over the following weeks, Philippe made his presence felt throughout the plantation. He timed work assignments with a pocket watch, calculated the precise caloric needs of field hands to maximize labor while minimizing food costs, and instituted a system of punishments that made the slaves' previous complaints about Nathaniel seem laughably mild. Most dangerously, Philippe watched everything. He had the predatory instincts of someone who'd built his fortune on reading human nature, and he sensed immediately that something was wrong with the social dynamics at Bellefonte. "Your kitchen woman," he said to Nathaniel one evening as they stood on the porch of the overseer's cabin. "Amélia, she seems influential among the others." Nathaniel's heart skipped, but he kept his voice steady. "She's been here longer than anyone. They respect her." "Respect?" Philippe smiled coldly. "Dangerous thing, respect. Makes slaves think they're people instead of property." He paused, studying Nathaniel's face. "You spend considerable time in the kitchen, I'm told. Checking supplies, coordinating meals for the field hands." "Of course." Philippe's tone suggested he didn't believe a word. "Still, appearances matter. We wouldn't want the slaves getting ideas about familiarity between management and labor." The warning was clear, and it terrified Nathaniel more than any direct threat could have. Philippe suspected something, even if he couldn't prove it yet. Worse, his influence over Master Rousseau was growing daily. The old man had begun deferring to his nephew's judgment on everything from crop rotation to punishment protocols. Nathaniel found Amélia in the kitchen that night, her hands shaking as she kneaded tomorrow's bread. She'd aged visibly in the weeks since Philippe's arrival, the stress carving new lines around her eyes. "He knows," she whispered without looking up. "That man. He knows something ain't right. He suspects. That's different from knowing. Is it?" Amelia's voice carried 60 years of experience reading white men's intentions. "I seen his kind before. He's like a hound dog. Once he catches a scent, he don't let go." Nathaniel moved closer, wanting to comfort her, but even here in their sanctuary, Philippe's presence made him cautious. "We'll be careful. More careful than before." "Careful ain't enough anymore." Amélia finally looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Fear. Not for herself, but for him. He's gonna push you, Nathaniel, push you to prove you ain't soft on us slaves. And when that happens—" She didn't finish the sentence, but they both understood. When Philippe forced Nathaniel to choose between his position and his principles, between his future and his feelings for Amélia, the arrangement that had sustained them for 3 years would become impossible to maintain. The crisis came sooner than expected. 2 weeks later, young Jacob was caught stealing food from the smokehouse, a handful of salt pork to feed his pregnant wife, who'd been getting smaller rations since Philippe's efficiency improvements. Under Nathaniel's previous management, Jacob would have received a stern warning, maybe a day of extra work, but Philippe was watching, and Master Rousseau was listening to his nephew's advice about the need for firm discipline. 20 lashes, Philippe announced. Public whipping. Make an example. Nathaniel's stomach turned. That seems excessive for theft? Philippe's eyebrows rose. My dear Nathaniel, theft is theft. If we show weakness now, every slave on this plantation will think they can help themselves to our property. The whipping was scheduled for the next morning. All slaves were required to watch Philippe's idea of education through terror. Nathaniel spent the night pacing his cabin, knowing that Jacob's screams would haunt him forever, knowing that Amélia would be forced to watch the brutalization of a boy she'd helped raise. But it was Amelia's reaction that truly terrified him. When he found her in the kitchen before dawn, she was perfectly calm, her movements deliberate and controlled. This was the composure of someone who'd made a decision. Don't do anything foolish, he pleaded. I know you care about Jacob, but if you interfere, I ain't gonna interfere. Her voice was steady, but something in it made Nathaniel's blood run cold. I learned long ago that sometimes you got to let the young ones suffer so the rest can survive. The whipping proceeded as scheduled. Jacob took his 20 lashes without crying out, his wife watching from the crowd with tears streaming down her face. Philippe observed with satisfaction, making notes in his ledger about the educational value of public punishment. But Nathaniel saw something else, the way the other slaves looked at him during the whipping. The trust he'd spent 3 years building evaporated in 20 strokes of the whip. He was no longer their reluctant protector. He was just another white man who watched them suffer. That night, when he came to the kitchen seeking comfort, Amélia was waiting with coffee and cornbread, just as she had for 3 years. But everything had changed. They hate me now, Nathaniel said, slumping into his usual chair. No, Amélia replied quietly. They understand you now. There's a difference. I had no choice. Philippe was watching. Rousseau was listening. I know. She sat across from him, her weathered hands wrapped around her coffee cup. You did what you had to do to survive, just like we do every day. But her understanding was somehow worse than hatred would have been. It meant she'd always known this moment would come, had always known that when forced to choose, he would choose his own survival over theirs. What happens now? He asked. Amélia was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if reading the future in its dark surface. Now you decide what kind of man you want to be, and I decide what kind of woman I can afford to be. Outside, the Red River flowed past the plantation, carrying away the day's pain toward the Gulf of Mexico. But some pain, Amélia knew, couldn't be washed away by water. Some pain had to be carried day after day until it either broke you or made you strong enough to break something else. The arrangement that had begun with mutual comfort and grown into dangerous love was transforming into something else entirely, a trap that would soon force both of them to choose between survival and destruction. Philippe Dufresne had succeeded in his goal of tightening discipline at Bellefonte Plantation. What he didn't realize was that pressure, applied long enough to the right person, could create something far more dangerous than rebellion. It could create desperation. When desperation meets impossible choices, even the strongest people can break. Tonight, you'll discover how a love that once brought comfort became a weapon that would destroy everything. Stay with me, because what Nathaniel demands of Amélia will leave you breathless. By late summer 1833, Philippe Dufresne had transformed Bellefonte Plantation into a model of brutal efficiency. Workdays stretched from dawn to dusk. Food rations were calculated to the ounce. Punishments were swift, public, and designed to break spirits along with bodies. Master Rousseau, initially hesitant about his nephew's methods, now praised Philippe's modern approach to plantation management. Cotton production was up 20%. Costs were down. The slaves worked with the mechanical precision of broken machinery. But Philippe wasn't satisfied. Something still bothered him about the social dynamics at Bellefonte, a subtle wrongness he couldn't quite identify. His instincts, honed by years in the slave trade, told him there were secrets hidden beneath the surface compliance. He began watching Nathaniel more closely, noting the young overseer's increasing nervousness, his reluctance to implement the harshest punishments, his tendency to linger near the kitchen quarters. Most telling was Nathaniel's relationship with the slaves. They obeyed him, but without the mixture of fear and respect that characterized proper management. "You're too familiar with them," Philippe said one evening as they reviewed the day's work reports. "The slaves, I mean. They don't fear you enough." Nathaniel's hand trembled slightly as he set down his pen. "They work hard. Production is meeting your targets. For now. But fear is like a crop. It requires constant cultivation. Let it go untended, and it withers." Felipe leaned back in his chair, studying Nathaniel with predatory interest. "I think you've forgotten that these people are property, not pets." "I haven't forgotten anything." "Haven't you?" Philippe's smile was cold. "Tell me, when was the last time you personally administered a whipping? When did you last make an example of someone?" Nathaniel's silence was answer enough. In 3 years as overseer, he'd managed to avoid personally inflicting the worst punishments, delegating such tasks to the slave drivers, or finding alternative consequences. It was a luxury Philippe would no longer permit. "Tomorrow," Philippe announced, "we're going to correct some bad habits, starting with yours." The next morning brought the kind of humid heat that made the Louisiana air feel solid, pressing down on the plantation like a suffocating blanket. Philippe had identified his target, Moses, the horse tender, who'd been caught allowing one of the mares to graze in the vegetable garden. 15 lashes, Philippe declared. "And Nathaniel will administer them personally." The words hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. Moses was 62 years old, his back already scarred from decades of punishment. 15 lashes could kill a man his age, or leave him permanently disabled. "Perhaps someone younger could," Nathaniel began. "No." Philippe's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "You will do this, or I'll recommend to Uncle Edmund that we find an overseer who can." The threat was clear. Refuse, and Nathaniel would lose his position, his income, his reason for being at Bellefonte. But more than that, he would lose Amélia. A new overseer would mean new arrangements, new dangers, new impossibilities. Moses was brought to the whipping post in the center of the slave quarters, his wrists bound above his head. The other slaves were assembled to watch, their faces carefully blank. Amélia stood with the kitchen staff, her dark eyes fixed on Nathaniel with an expression he couldn't read. Philippe handed Nathaniel the whip, 9 feet of braided leather designed to tear flesh from bone. "Proceed." Nathaniel's hands shook as he gripped the handle. He'd held this whip before, carried it as a symbol of authority, but never used it. The weight felt wrong in his hands, too heavy and too light at the same time. "I'm waiting," Philippe said softly. The first lash was weak, barely marking Moses's skin. Philippe clicked his tongue in disapproval. "That won't do. Put your back into it." The second lash drew blood. Moses grunted but didn't cry out. The third opened a gash across his shoulder blades. By the 5th, Nathaniel was sobbing, tears streaming down his face as he continued the brutal work. Amélia watched it all, her expression never changing. But inside, something fundamental was breaking. This was the man she'd loved for 3 years, the man she'd comforted and counseled and given her body to. This was the man who'd promised her that love could transcend the barriers between them. When it was over, Moses was cut down and carried away by the other slaves. Philippe clapped Nathaniel on the shoulder with mock congratulation. "Much better. You're learning." That night, Nathaniel came to the kitchen as usual, but everything had changed. His hands still shook from the morning's violence. His clothes still carried the smell of Moses's blood. "I had no choice," he said before Amélia could speak. "You understand that, don't you? I had no choice." Amélia poured coffee with steady hands, her movements automatic after 3 years of this ritual. "We all got choices, Nathaniel. Some just cost more than others. If I'd refused, Philippe would have had me dismissed. Then what? A new overseer, probably worse than Philippe himself. At least with me here I can protect... Protect who?" The question came out sharper than Amélia intended. "You just whipped Moses near to death. You think that's protection?" It's survival, for all of us. No, Amélia set down the coffee pot with deliberate care. It's survival for you. The rest of us just got to live with the consequences. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 3 years pressing down between them. Finally, Nathaniel reached across the table and took her hand. "Come away with me." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Amélia stared at him, not quite believing what she'd heard. "What? Leave? Tonight? We'll go north, to Ohio or Pennsylvania. I have some money saved, enough to get us started. We can be free there, together." Amélia pulled her hand away, as if his touch burned. "You lost your mind?" "I'm serious. I can't do this anymore, Amélia. I can't be the man Felipe wants me to be, but I can't lose you either." His voice cracked with desperation. "We can start over somewhere else, be together openly. And my children, my grandchildren, the people I've been protecting for 60 years? Amelia's voice rose, then dropped to a whisper. "You want me to abandon them so you can feel better about yourself? They're not your responsibility. They're my blood." The words exploded from her with decades of suppressed emotion. "You think I can just walk away from my babies because you finally figured out what kind of man you really are?" Nathaniel recoiled as if she'd struck him. "That's not... I love you, Amélia. Doesn't that mean anything?" "Love?" She laughed bitterly. "You love the idea of me, the comfort I give you, the way I make you feel like a good man despite everything. But you don't love me enough to understand what you're asking. I'm asking you to choose freedom. You're asking me to choose you over everyone else I ever loved. That ain't freedom, Nathaniel. That's just another kind of slavery." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the Red River flowed past the plantation, carrying away the day's heat toward the Gulf of Mexico. But the heat between them, the passion that had sustained them through 3 years of impossible love, was cooling into something harder and more dangerous. "If you won't come willingly," Nathaniel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'll have to make you understand why you need to." "What's that supposed to mean?" Nathaniel's eyes met hers, and Amélia saw something there that chilled her blood. Desperation had transformed into something else, a kind of madness born from the collision of love and impossibility. "Philippe suspects something. He's been watching, asking questions. If he finds out about us..." Nathaniel leaned forward, his voice urgent. "They'll kill you, Amélia. Not just whip you or sell you, they'll hang you for corrupting a white man, and they'll make me watch. So you're threatening me now? I'm trying to save you. Save us both." His hand reached for hers again, but she pulled away. "Come with me tonight, or I'll have to tell Felipe what I know about the other slaves, about Samuel's plans to run north, about the weapons hidden in the barn, about..." "Stop." Amelia's voice was deadly quiet. Just stop, but Nathaniel was beyond stopping, driven by 3 years of accumulated pressure and the terrible realization that he was losing everything that mattered to him. "I'll tell him everything, Amélia. Every secret, every plan, every hope these people have. I'll destroy them all to save you." The threat hung between them like a blade. Amélia stared at this man she'd loved, this boy she'd comforted and counseled and given her body to, and saw him clearly for the first time. When forced to choose between her freedom and her people's survival, he would sacrifice everyone else to get what he wanted. "Get out," she whispered. "Amélia, get out of my kitchen. Get out of my sight. And don't you ever come back here talking about love." Nathaniel stood slowly, his face pale in the lamplight. "You have until tomorrow night to decide. Come with me, or watch everything you've tried to protect burn to the ground." He left her sitting in the darkness, surrounded by the tools of her trade, knives and skillets and cast-iron pots that had fed a plantation for 3 years, tools that could nourish or destroy, depending on how they were used. Amélia sat in the silence for a long time, thinking about choices and consequences, about love and survival, about the difference between protection and destruction. By the time the sun rose, she had made her decision. Some threats she knew could only be answered with blood. When love becomes a weapon and protection becomes impossible, even the gentlest soul can be driven to violence. Tonight, you'll witness the moment Amélia realizes that some threats can only be answered with blood. Don't turn away now. What happens next will change everything you thought you knew about survival. The day after Nathaniel's ultimatum dawned grey and oppressive, with storm clouds gathering over the Red River like an omen. Amélia went about her morning routine with mechanical precision, lighting the kitchen fires, preparing breakfast for the big house, kneading bread for the evening meal. But her mind was elsewhere, calculating possibilities and consequences with the cold logic of someone who'd spent 60 years navigating impossible situations. She had until nightfall to decide: abandon everyone she'd ever loved to save herself, or watch Nathaniel destroy them all out of spite and desperation. But Amélia had learned something in 6 decades of bondage that Nathaniel, for all his education and privilege, had never understood. Sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to destroy what threatens it. The morning brought its usual parade of plantation business. Philippe conducted his daily inspection with military precision, timing work assignments and calculating efficiency ratios. Master Rousseau followed behind like an eager student, absorbing his nephew's lessons in modern management. Nathaniel moved through his duties like a man walking in his sleep, his face pale and his hands trembling whenever he thought no one was watching. But Amélia was always watching. She'd made a career of reading white men's moods and intentions, and what she saw in Nathaniel terrified her more than Philippe's calculated cruelty ever could. Philippe was predictable, a businessman who saw slaves as inventory to be managed efficiently. Nathaniel had become something far more dangerous, a desperate man with nothing left to lose. Around midday, Samuel approached the kitchen with a broken harness that needed mending. As Amélia examined the leather straps, he spoke in the low, careful voice slaves used when discussing dangerous topics. Word is, the young master been asking questions about who goes where after dark, who talks to who. Samuel's weathered hands worked the leather as he spoke. Some folks getting nervous. Amélia nodded without looking up. Folks got reason to be nervous. You know something we should know. For a moment, Amélia considered telling Samuel everything. About the 3-year arrangement, about Nathaniel's threats, about the impossible choice she faced. But she'd spent 60 years protecting her people by keeping dangerous secrets, and she wouldn't stop now. Just keep your heads down, she said finally. Storm's coming, but it'll pass. Samuel studied her face, reading the weight behind her words. What kind of storm? The kind that changes everything. That afternoon, while Philippe conducted his efficiency reviews and Master Rousseau tallied cotton projections, Amélia made her preparations. She moved through the kitchen with purpose, gathering what she would need. A cast-iron skillet heavy enough to crack bone. A sharp knife, honed to razor sharpness for cutting meat, a length of rope, ostensibly for hanging herbs to dry. Most importantly, she composed a letter, the first she'd written in 40 years, laboriously scratched out on a piece of paper torn from Master Rousseau's account books. The words came slowly, her hand cramped from decades of labor, but the message was clear. Master Rousseau, your overseer been taking liberties with slave women. Check the grain cellar tonight after midnight. You'll find proof of what I'm saying. A concerned friend. It was a lie, of course. But it was the kind of lie that would explain what Philippe would find in the morning. Nathaniel's body in the grain cellar, killed by a jealous husband or outraged father defending family honor. The kind of lie that would protect the other slaves from suspicion while giving the white men a story they could accept. As evening approached, Amélia felt a strange calm settle over her. She'd made her choice, and with it came a kind of peace she hadn't experienced in 3 years. No more stolen moments in the kitchen, no more whispered promises about impossible futures, no more watching the man she loved transform into something monstrous under pressure. Nathaniel appeared at the kitchen door just after sunset, his face haggard and his clothes disheveled. He'd been drinking. She could smell the whiskey on his breath from across the room. "Have you decided?" he asked without preamble. Amélia continued stirring the pot of stew she was preparing for tomorrow's breakfast. "I've decided." "And?" She turned to face him, and for a moment he saw something in her expression that made him step backward. It was the look of someone who'd moved beyond fear into a realm where only necessity mattered. "I'll meet you in the grain cellar at midnight," she said quietly. "We can talk there, away from prying eyes." Relief flooded Nathaniel's face. "You'll come with me? Leave tonight? We'll discuss it." Midnight, in the cellar. He nodded eagerly, too desperate to notice the careful way she'd phrased her answer. "I knew you'd understand. I knew you'd see that this is the only way." After he left, Amélia finished her preparations. She banked the kitchen fires, cleaned her workspace, and set out ingredients for tomorrow's breakfast. A routine she'd followed for 3 years, though she knew she wouldn't be there to complete it. At 11:30, she made her way across the darkened plantation toward the grain cellar. The building stood apart from the other structures, isolated enough that sounds wouldn't carry to the slave quarters or the big house. It was where Nathaniel had suggested they meet for their final conversation, and it would be where their arrangement finally ended. The cellar was dark when she arrived, lit only by a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Nathaniel was already there, pacing nervously among the sacks of corn and barrels of flour. He'd brought a traveling bag, everything he owned packed for their escape north. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I was afraid you'd changed your mind." "I came to talk," Amélia replied, closing the door behind her. "Like I promised." "There's nothing to talk about. We leave tonight before Philippe can—" "Before Philippe can what?" Amelia's voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it. "Before he can find out what you really are?" Nathaniel stopped pacing. "What I really am, I'm a man who loves you, who's trying to save us both. You're a man who just threatened to destroy innocent people to get what you want. You think that's love?" "I think that's survival." Nathaniel's voice rose, then dropped to a whisper. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Philippe watches everything I do, questions every decision. If he finds out about us, then you should have thought about that 3 years ago before you started coming to my kitchen every night." The words hit Nathaniel like physical blows. "You wanted it too. Don't pretend you didn't. I wanted comfort. I wanted to feel human for a few hours instead of like property, but I never wanted this. Threats and ultimatums and watching you turn into the kind of man who'd sacrifice children to save himself. I'm not sacrificing anyone. I'm trying to protect you by threatening to tell Philippe about Samuel's escape plans, about the weapons in the barn." Amélia stepped closer, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "Those ain't your secrets to tell, Nathaniel. Those are my people's hopes, and you'd destroy them just to force me to run away with you. Because I love you." "No." Amelia's voice was quiet but final. "You love the idea of me, the way I made you feel like a good man despite everything. But you don't love me enough to understand what you're asking me to give up." Nathaniel stared at her, seeing clearly for the first time the woman he'd thought he knew. In the lamplight, Amélia looked older than her 60 years, worn down by decades of impossible choices and unthinkable sacrifices. But there was strength in her weathered face, a kind of dignity that no amount of brutality had been able to break. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I'm saying this ends here. Tonight. No more meetings, no more promises, no more pretending that what we had was anything more than two lonely people finding comfort in the dark. And if I tell Philippe about the others, about their plans—" Amélia reached into her apron and pulled out the cast-iron skillet she'd brought from the kitchen. The weight of it felt right in her hands. Familiar, purposeful, final. "Then you'll have to live with the consequences," she said quietly. "Just like I've had to live with mine." Nathaniel saw the skillet and laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. "You're going to threaten me now, an old woman with a cooking pan?" "I ain't threatening nobody. I'm just telling you how this is going to end." The laughter died in Nathaniel's throat as he recognized something in Amelia's voice. The same calm certainty he'd heard in the voices of men facing execution, the peace that came with accepting the inevitable. "Amélia, please. We can work this out. We can't work out nothing. You made sure of that when you decided my love was worth more than my people's lives." She raised the skillet, and Nathaniel finally understood that this wasn't a negotiation. This was an ending, written in the only language that mattered in a world built on violence and oppression. "I love you," he whispered, and for the first time in months it sounded like the truth. "I know," Amélia replied. "That's what makes this so hard." The skillet came down with 60 years of accumulated rage behind it, 60 years of swallowed pride and suppressed dignity and impossible choices. It connected with Nathaniel's skull with a sound like breaking pottery, and he crumpled to the floor among the sacks of grain. Amélia stood over his body for a long moment, the skillet still in her hands, listening to the silence that followed violence. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, sending rain against the cellar walls like tears. She thought about the letter she'd left for Master Rousseau, about the story it would tell and the questions it would answer. She thought about the other slaves who would wake tomorrow to find their secrets still safe, their plans still possible. She thought about her children and grandchildren scattered across Louisiana and Mississippi who would continue to survive because she'd made the hardest choice of all. Most of all, she thought about Nathaniel, young, desperate, broken by a system that had destroyed them both in different ways. She'd loved him truly and completely for 3 years. But love, in their world, was a luxury that could cost everything. Some choices, Amélia knew, could only be made once. Some prices could only be paid in blood, and some kinds of love were too dangerous to survive. The storm raged outside, washing the plantation clean for another day of impossible survival. But in the grain cellar, surrounded by the tools of sustenance and the weight of necessity, Amélia had finally found a kind of peace. The arrangement was over. The reckoning had begun. The morning after Nathaniel's murder, Belafonte Plantation became a powder keg of suspicion and fear. But as the investigation unfolds, you'll discover that some secrets are harder to uncover than others, and some lies are more dangerous than the truth. Keep watching, because what the sheriff finds will shock you. Dawn broke grey and sullen over Belafonte Plantation, the storm having passed, but leaving the air thick with humidity and the smell of wet earth. Master Rousseau found the anonymous letter slipped under his office door when he came down for his morning coffee, the crude handwriting barely legible in the pale light. Your overseer been taking liberties with slave women. Check the grain cellar tonight after midnight. You'll find proof of what I'm saying. Rousseau's hands trembled as he read the words twice, then a third time. Taking liberties. The euphemism covered a multitude of sins, all of them potentially catastrophic for a plantation's reputation. If word spread that his overseer had been forcing himself on slave women, he found Nathaniel's body 20 minutes later, sprawled among the sacks of corn with his skull cracked open like an egg. The sight sent him stumbling backward, his breakfast rising in his throat. In 40 years of plantation management, he'd seen plenty of violence, whippings, beatings, the occasional accident that befell troublesome slaves. But this was different. This was his overseer, a white man, murdered on his own property. Felipe arrived within the hour, summoned by a breathless house slave. He examined the scene with the cold efficiency of someone accustomed to violence, noting the position of the body, the weapon, a cast-iron skillet that had been left beside Nathaniel's head, and the complete absence of any signs of struggle. Whoever did this caught him completely by surprise, Philippe observed, crouching beside the body. One blow, perfectly placed, either very lucky or very skilled. Sheriff Boudreau arrived by mid-morning, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. The anonymous letter had already shaped his thinking. This was about sexual impropriety, about a slave woman defending her honor or a slave man defending his family. Such cases were delicate, requiring careful handling to avoid inflaming tensions throughout the parish. "Line them up," he ordered, just as he had 3 years earlier when investigating a different kind of plantation violence. Every slave, every worker. "I want to see hands, clothes, anything that might show signs of blood or struggle." The slaves assembled in the yard, with the weary resignation of people accustomed to collective punishment. They stood in neat rows under the blazing Louisiana sun, while Boudreau examined each one, looking for scratches, bruises, bloodstains, any physical evidence that might identify Nathaniel's killer. Amélia stood with the kitchen staff, her weathered hands clasped in front of her, her dark eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the cotton fields. She'd washed thoroughly before dawn, scrubbing away any trace of the previous night's violence, and changed into a clean dress. Her movements were calm, deliberate, showing none of the nervous energy that marked the other slaves. "You," Boudreau pointed at Samuel, the wagon driver. "Step forward." Samuel approached with obvious reluctance, his massive frame tense with barely controlled fear. At 55, he was one of the strongest men on the plantation, easily capable of overpowering a younger man like Nathaniel. "Where were you last night between midnight and dawn?" "In my cabin, sir, sleeping with my wife and children." "Anyone else see you there?" "My family, sir, and the folks in the cabin next door. Walls ain't thick." Boudreau made notes in his ledger, then moved on to Moses, the horse tender. The old man's back was still bandaged from the whipping Nathaniel had administered just weeks earlier. Clear motive for revenge. "You had reason to hate Overseer Burke," Boudreau observed. Moses kept his eyes downcast. I don't hate nobody, sir. Hate's a luxury I can't afford. But he whipped you. 20 lashes for letting a horse graze where it shouldn't. That must have made you angry. Angry don't change nothing, sir, just makes things worse. The questioning continued through the morning, each slave offering alibis that were impossible to verify but difficult to disprove. They'd been in their cabins, sleeping with family members who would naturally lie to protect them. They'd been tending sick children, mending clothes, praying, the mundane activities that filled the hours between exhaustion and dawn. When Boudreau reached Amélia, he paused. Something about her composure bothered him, the same wrongness he'd sensed 3 years earlier during his previous investigation. She was too calm, too controlled, like someone who'd prepared for this moment. State your name and position. Amélia, sir. Kitchen supervisor. How long have you worked in that position? 15 years, sir. Been cooking for the big house since Master Rousseau's daddy was alive. And last night? Where were you between midnight and dawn? In the kitchen, sir. Preparing breakfast, same as always. Anyone see you there? No, sir, I work alone at night. Boudreau circled her slowly, noting the steadiness of her hands, the way she met his gaze without flinching. In his experience, guilty slaves either broke down immediately or overcompensated with elaborate stories. Amélia did neither. She simply existed, patient as stone. The weapon was a kitchen implement, he observed, a cast-iron skillet from your domain. Yes, sir. I noticed it was missing this morning. When did you last see it? Yesterday evening, sir. Used it to fry chicken for the big house dinner. And you didn't notice it was gone until this morning? No, sir. I got dozens of pots and pans. Don't count them every night. Philippe stepped forward, his calculating eyes fixed on Amélia. Sheriff, if I may, this woman has been at Bellefonte longer than anyone. She knows every secret, every hiding place, every weakness. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if someone wanted to move through this plantation unseen, to strike without warning, they'd need intimate knowledge of the layout, the routines, the vulnerabilities. Philippe's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Who better than the kitchen supervisor? Boudreau considered this, studying Amélia's weathered face. You knew Overseer Burke well? Well enough, sir. He came to the kitchen regular-like, checking on supplies and such. Just checking on supplies? The question hung in the air like smoke. Amélia felt the weight of 43 pairs of eyes watching her, waiting to see how she'd respond. One wrong word, one hint of the truth, and everything she'd sacrificed to protect would be destroyed. Yes, sir, just supplies. The anonymous letter suggests otherwise. It claims Burke was taking liberties with slave women. Do you know anything about that? Amelia's expression never changed, but inside, her heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment she'd prepared for, the lie that would either save them all or damn them. I wouldn't know nothing about that, sir. Master Burke always conducted himself proper around the kitchen staff. Always? Yes, sir, always. Philippe's eyes narrowed. Something in her tone, some subtle emphasis, suggested layers of meaning beneath the simple words. Sheriff, I think we should search her quarters. Look for evidence, blood-stained clothing, anything that might— Already done, Boudreau interrupted. Searched every cabin, every hiding place. Found nothing. It was true. Amelia's quarters had been thoroughly examined, revealing only the sparse possessions of someone who'd spent 60 years owning nothing. The blood-stained dress from the previous night had been burned in the kitchen fires before dawn, reduced to ash and scattered to the wind. As the morning wore on, Boudreau's frustration grew. The physical evidence was minimal, a single blow to the head, no signs of struggle, no witnesses, no clear motive that couldn't apply to half the slaves on the plantation. The anonymous letter suggested sexual impropriety, but none of the slave women would admit to being assaulted, and Nathaniel's reputation, while not spotless, contained no obvious scandals. This is getting us nowhere, Philippe muttered as they watched the slaves return to their work assignments. Someone killed Burke, and someone knows who did it. These people protect each other, Boudreau replied. Always have, always will. Breaking their silence requires special methods. The threat was clear, and it sent a chill through the assembled slaves. Special methods meant torture, systematic brutality designed to extract confessions through pain. Someone would be selected as an example, beaten until they provided names, real or fabricated. But before Boudreau could implement his special methods, Master Rousseau appeared with news that changed everything. "Sheriff?" he called from the porch of the big house, waving a piece of paper. "I've received word from the parish courthouse. There's been a development." The three white men gathered on the porch, while the slaves continued their work, straining to overhear fragments of conversation carried on the humid air. "What kind of development?" Boudreau asked. "A witness," Rousseau replied, his voice tight with excitement. "Someone saw a figure moving through the plantation last night around midnight, a woman heading toward the grain cellar." Philippa leaned forward. "Who? Which woman?" The witness couldn't be certain in the darkness, but... Rousseau paused dramatically. "They described someone tall, moving with purpose, carrying something heavy." Boudreau's mind raced through the possibilities. Most of the slave women were small, worn down by decades of hard labor, but there were exceptions. Women whose size and strength made them capable of overpowering a man like Nathaniel. "Bring me the tall ones," he ordered. Every woman over 5.5 feet, every woman strong enough to swing a skillet with killing force. The selection process was humiliating and terrifying. Women were measured against a marked post, their height recorded in Boudreau's ledger. Their hands were examined for calluses that might indicate unusual strength. Their reputations were discussed like livestock evaluations. Amélia, at 5 feet 4 inches, was dismissed immediately. Too small, too old, too frail to have committed such a violent act. The irony wasn't lost on her. 60 years of being underestimated by white men had finally worked in her favor. But as the investigation focused on other suspects, Amélia felt no relief. She watched as younger, stronger women were subjected to increasingly aggressive questioning, their alibis picked apart, their families threatened. Sarah, who worked in the laundry and stood nearly 6 feet tall. Rebecca, who helped with the heavy lifting in the smokehouse. Mary, whose husband had been sold away just months earlier, leaving her with clear motive for revenge against any white man. The special methods began that afternoon. Sarah was selected first, tied to the whipping post, and subjected to increasingly brutal questioning. When she maintained her innocence, the lash fell across her back. When she continued to deny involvement, the questions turned to her knowledge of other slaves' activities. Amélia watched from the kitchen window, her hands clenched into fists as Sarah's screams echoed across the plantation. This was the price of her choice, innocent people suffering for her actions, bearing the weight of her decision to protect them all. But as the sun set over Bellefonte plantation, casting long shadows across the cotton fields, Amélia knew she'd made the only choice possible. Nathaniel's threats would have destroyed far more people than his death ever could. Sometimes protection required sacrifice, and sometimes love demanded the ultimate price. The investigation would continue, she knew. More women would be questioned, more backs would be bloodied, more families would be torn apart by suspicion and fear. But the secrets that mattered, the escape plans, the hidden weapons, the network of hope that sustained her people, those would remain safe. In the grain cellar where Nathaniel had died, sacks of corn waited to feed the plantation through another season. The blood had been cleaned away, the evidence removed, the story rewritten to fit the needs of those who survived. Some truths, Amélia understood, were too dangerous to speak. Some lies were more merciful than honesty, and some kinds of love could only be preserved through violence. The Red River flowed past the plantation in the gathering darkness, carrying away the day's pain toward the Gulf of Mexico. But some pain, Amélia knew, had to be carried forever. The weight of necessary choices, the burden of protecting what mattered most, the terrible knowledge that sometimes the greatest act of love was also the greatest crime. As the investigation reaches its climax, the truth about Nathaniel's murder threatens to destroy everything Amélia has fought to protect. But in a world built on lies and violence, sometimes the most dangerous truth is the one that sets you free. Stay until the end. What happens next will leave you breathless. 3 days after Nathaniel Burke's murder, Bellefonte plantation had become a place of whispers and shadows. The investigation had consumed everything, turning neighbor against neighbor, family against family, as Sheriff Boudreau's special methods extracted confessions that contradicted each other and alibis that crumbled under torture. Sarah had finally broken after 20 lashes, sobbing out a story about seeing Rebecca near the grain cellar. Rebecca, under similar pressure, had implicated Mary. Mary, desperate to protect her children, had pointed to Moses, claiming she'd seen him sharpening a knife the day before the murder. The circle of accusations was tightening, but it was also becoming increasingly absurd. Boudreau found himself with too many suspects and too many conflicting stories, none of which explained how an elderly slave woman's kitchen skillet had ended up beside Nathaniel's body. Philippe Dufresne watched the chaos with growing frustration. His instincts told him the real killer was still walking free, probably laughing at the white men's inability to solve a simple murder. Worse, the investigation was disrupting plantation operations. Cotton needed picking, but half the field hands were too terrified to work effectively, jumping at shadows and expecting to be dragged away for questioning at any moment. "This is accomplishing nothing," Philippe told his uncle as they stood on the gallery, watching Boudreau prepare for another round of interrogations. "We're destroying our own labor force to catch one killer." Master Rousseau nodded reluctantly. The past 3 days had aged him visibly, the stress of having a murder on his property weighing heavily on his shoulders. "What do you suggest?" "We make an example. Pick the most likely suspect and hang them publicly. The others will get the message. But what if we're wrong? What if the real killer— Does it matter?" Philippe's voice was cold with pragmatic calculation. "The goal isn't justice, Uncle. It's control. These slaves need to understand that killing a white man has consequences, regardless of who actually did it." Before Rousseau could respond, a commotion erupted in the yard below. Boudreau was shouting orders, his deputies moving with sudden urgency. A new witness had come forward, a field hand named Thomas, who claimed to have remembered something crucial about the night of the murder. "I seen her," Thomas gasped, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to please. "Seen her clear as day, walking toward the cellar with something in her hands." "Who?" Boudreau demanded. "Which woman?" "The old one, the kitchen woman, Amélia." The words hit the assembled crowd like a thunderbolt. Amélia, who'd been dismissed as too small and frail to commit such a violent act. Amélia, who'd stood calmly through 3 days of investigation, never wavering in her story. Philippe's eyes lit up with predatory satisfaction. Of course, the perfect suspect, invisible, trusted, with access to the weapon and intimate knowledge of the plantation's routines. But as the deputies moved to arrest Amélia, she was nowhere to be found. The kitchen was empty, her quarters abandoned, her few possessions scattered as if she'd left in haste. "Search everywhere," Boudreau ordered. "The barns, the fields, the river. She can't have gone far." They found her an hour later, sitting quietly by the Red River with her feet in the water, watching the current flow toward the Gulf of Mexico. She made no attempt to run when the deputies approached, simply stood and brushed the dirt from her dress with the dignity of someone who'd made peace with her fate. "Amélia," Boudreau said, as the shackles clicked around her wrists, "you're under arrest for the murder of Nathaniel Burke." "Yes, sir," she replied quietly. "I expect I am." The confession came that evening, delivered in the same calm voice she'd used to deny involvement just days earlier. Sitting in the makeshift jail cell they'd constructed in the plantation's tool shed, Amélia told her story with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed it carefully. "He was forcing himself on the young women," she said, her dark eyes fixed on Sheriff Boudreau's face. "Been doing it for months, threatening to have them sold if they told anyone. I couldn't let it continue." "So you killed him?" "I confronted him, told him to stop. He laughed, said there wasn't nothing an old woman like me could do about it." Amelia's voice never wavered. "So I showed him what this old woman could do." It was a lie, of course, but it was the kind of lie that white men could understand and accept. A protective mother figure defending innocent young women from sexual predation. It fit their expectations of how slaves should behave, noble and self-sacrificing within the boundaries of their station. Philippe listened to the confession with satisfaction, already planning the public execution that would restore order to Bellefonte Plantation. But something nagged at him, some detail that didn't quite fit the narrative Amélia was presenting. "Which women?" he asked suddenly. "Which specific women was Burke assaulting?" Amélia met his gaze steadily. "I ain't gonna name names, sir. They've been through enough without having their shame made public. But surely you can give us some indication." "No, sir, I can't and I won't." The refusal was delivered with such quiet dignity that even Philippe found himself momentarily speechless. Here was a woman facing certain death, yet still protecting others with her silence. The trial, such as it was, took place the next morning in the parlor of the big house. Master Rousseau served as judge, Philippe as prosecutor, and a nervous young lawyer from town as Amelia's defense counsel. The proceedings were a formality. Everyone knew the outcome before they began. Amélia sat in the defendant's chair with her hands folded in her lap, listening as witness after witness testified to her good character, her decades of faithful service, her reputation as a protector of the younger slaves. Even Thomas, the field hand who'd identified her, seemed reluctant to repeat his accusation under oath. When called upon to speak in her own defense, Amélia stood slowly, her joints protesting after a night on the tool shed's hard floor. "I ain't got much to say," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded room. "I done what I done, and I ain't sorry for it. Sometimes protecting what you love means paying a price you never wanted to pay." She paused, her gaze moving across the faces of the slaves who'd been allowed to witness the proceedings. Samuel, whose escape plans were still secret, Moses, whose back was healing from Nathaniel's whip, Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary, who'd suffered under Boudreaux's questioning, but were now safe from further suspicion. "I've been on this plantation for 56 years, Amélia continued. Seen children born and sold away, seen families torn apart, seen good people broken by things they couldn't control. But I also seen love survive in places where it shouldn't be possible. Seen people protect each other when they had every reason to look out for themselves." Her voice grew stronger, carrying the weight of 6 decades of accumulated wisdom. "Y'all think you own us, but you don't own what matters. You don't own our hearts, our hopes, our love for each other, and you can't kill that no matter how many of us you hang." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Philippe seemed momentarily affected by the quiet power of her words. But the law was the law, and the sentence was inevitable. "Amélia," Master Rousseau said formally, "you have been found guilty of the murder of Nathaniel Burke. You will be hanged by the neck until dead, sentenced to be carried out at dawn tomorrow." "Yes, sir," Amélia replied. "I understand." That night, as she sat in her makeshift cell awaiting execution, Amélia received a steady stream of visitors, slaves who risked punishment to say goodbye, to thank her for her sacrifice, to promise that her story would be remembered. Samuel came first, his massive frame barely fitting through the tool shed door. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why didn't you let us help? We could have found another way." "There wasn't no other way," Amélia replied. "And this way y'all stay safe. Your plans, your hopes, your families, they all stay protected." Moses came next, moving carefully on his healing back. "The young master, he really been forcing himself on the women?" Amélia met his eyes steadily. "Does it matter? Story's told now, and it's the story that'll keep y'all safe." One by one, they came to pay their respects to the woman who'd spent her life protecting them and would spend her death doing the same. Each visitor understood that Amelia's confession was both truth and lie, justice and sacrifice, ending and beginning. As dawn approached, Amélia sat alone in the darkness thinking about the choices that had brought her to this moment. She thought about Nathaniel, young and desperate and broken by a system that had destroyed them both. She thought about the love they'd shared, impossible and doomed but real nonetheless. Most of all, she thought about the future, about Samuel's escape plans, about the weapons hidden in the barn, about the network of hope and resistance that would continue long after she was gone. Her death would buy them time, safety, the chance to survive, and perhaps even thrive. The sun rose over Bellefonte Plantation like a promise, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The gallows had been erected in the center of the slave quarters, a reminder to all who witnessed it that some crimes could not be forgiven. Amélia walked to her execution with the same dignity she'd shown throughout her life, her head high and her steps steady. The rope felt rough against her neck, but her voice was clear as she spoke her final words. "I ain't sorry," she said, her gaze moving across the faces of her people one last time. "Love ain't never something to be sorry for, even when it costs everything." The trapdoor opened, and Amélia fell into history, a woman who'd loved impossibly, chosen courageously, and died protecting what mattered most. Her body swayed gently in the morning breeze, but her spirit soared free, carried away by the Red River toward something larger than any one person's pain. In the kitchen where she'd spent her final years, breakfast waited to be prepared by other hands. In the fields where her people labored, cotton waited to be picked by those she'd died to protect. And in the hearts of everyone who'd known her, Amelia's story lived on, a testament to the power of love to transcend even death itself. The investigation was over, the reckoning had begun, and somewhere in the distance, the Red River flowed toward the Gulf of Mexico, carrying secrets and stories, and the eternal promise that some kinds of love are stronger than any force that tries to destroy them. Words BTO 498 Epilogue, The Legacy. 10 years have passed since Amelia's execution, but her story refuses to die. What happened next will show you that some sacrifices echo through generations, and some kinds of love are truly eternal. This is the final chapter. Don't miss how this incredible story ends. Louisiana, 1843. The young woman who called herself Sarah Freeman stepped off the riverboat at New Orleans with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a letter of introduction to the Underground Railroad. At 25, she was tall and strong, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets older than her years. What the abolitionists who welcomed her didn't know was that Sarah Freeman had been born Sarah Washington on Belafonte Plantation, the granddaughter of a woman named Amélia, who died on the gallows 10 years earlier. The story of that execution had shaped Sarah's entire life, passed down through whispered conversations and coded songs that preserved the truth beneath layers of protective fiction. Belafonte Plantation itself had changed dramatically in the decade since Nathaniel Burke's murder. Philippe Dufresne had eventually inherited the property from his uncle, transforming it into a model of industrial efficiency that other planters studied and envied. The slaves worked longer hours for smaller rations, their lives regulated by bells and timekeepers that measured every moment of productivity. But beneath the surface efficiency, something had shifted. The network of resistance that Amélia had died to protect had grown stronger, more sophisticated, more dangerous to the system that tried to contain it. Her execution had become a rallying point, a reminder that some things were worth dying for. Samuel, now in his 60s, had become the unofficial leader of this underground network. The escape plans that Nathaniel had threatened to expose had evolved into a sophisticated operation that moved enslaved people north along carefully mapped routes. The weapons hidden in the barn had multiplied, cached in secret locations throughout the parish. Most importantly, Amelia's story had become legend, told and retold until it transcended the specific details of her life to become something larger. She was the grandmother who'd sacrificed everything for her people's freedom, the lover who'd chosen justice over personal happiness, the woman who'd proved that even the most powerless could change the course of history. Sarah Freeman carried that legacy in her blood and her bones as she made her way through the streets of New Orleans, following directions to a safe house where other refugees from slavery waited for passage north. She'd escaped from Belafonte 3 months earlier, part of a carefully coordinated operation that had freed 17 people in a single night. The escape had been planned for years, timed to coincide with Philippe's absence on business in New Orleans. Samuel had used his knowledge of the plantation's routines, knowledge passed down from Amelia's careful observations, to identify the perfect moment when security would be lightest. They'd moved like ghosts through the Louisiana night, following paths that Amélia had mapped in her mind during 60 years of bondage, past the grain cellar where Nathaniel had died, past the kitchen where impossible love had bloomed and withered, past the gallows where justice and sacrifice had become indistinguishable. Not everyone had made it. 3 of the escapees had been recaptured within days, returned to face punishments that served as warnings to anyone else who might consider flight. But 14 had reached freedom, including Sarah, who carried with her something more valuable than her own liberty. In her carpet bag, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture, was a journal that Amélia had kept during her final years. Written in the margins of discarded account books and on scraps of paper saved from the big house, it told the true story of her relationship with Nathaniel Burke, not the sanitized version she'd confessed to save her people, but the complex reality of love and power, choice and coercion, survival and sacrifice. The journal revealed truths that would have been too dangerous to speak while Amélia lived, how Nathaniel's initial kindness had gradually transformed into possessive desperation, how their stolen moments of tenderness had become tainted by the fundamental impossibility of their situation. How love, in a system built on dehumanization, could become another form of violence. But it also revealed something else. The careful way Amélia had documented every detail of plantation life, every weakness in its security, every opportunity for resistance. Her love affair with Nathaniel had been real, but it had also been a form of intelligence gathering, a way of learning the enemy's vulnerabilities while appearing to submit to them. Sarah had memorized every word of that journal before burning it in a New Orleans fireplace, ensuring that its secrets would live on in human memory rather than vulnerable paper. The knowledge it contained would help other enslaved people escape, other families reunite, other communities survive the ongoing horror of bondage. As she settled into her new life in Philadelphia, working as a seamstress and sending money south to support the Underground Railroad, Sarah often thought about her grandmother's legacy. Amélia had died believing she was protecting her people's immediate survival, but her sacrifice had accomplished something far greater. The story of her execution had spread throughout the slave communities of Louisiana and beyond, carried by the same networks that moved people toward freedom. It had become a parable about the power of love to transcend even death, about the way individual sacrifice could inspire collective resistance. In the cotton fields of Mississippi, enslaved people sang coded songs that told of an old woman who'd chosen love over life. In the tobacco plantations of Virginia, mothers told their children stories about a grandmother who'd proved that even the powerless could change history. In the rice paddies of South Carolina, resistance leaders invoked Amélia's name when planning operations that would free hundreds from bondage. The love story that had begun in a plantation kitchen had become something larger than romance. It had become revolution. Philippe Dufresne, now in his 40s, and one of the wealthiest planters in Louisiana, sometimes stood in the grain cellar where Nathaniel Burke had died and wondered about the forces that had shaped that night. He'd never quite believed Amélia's confession, had always suspected that deeper currents of resistance flowed beneath the surface of plantation life. But he'd also learned to live with uncertainty, to accept that some secrets would never be fully revealed. The important thing was maintaining control, preserving the system that had made his fortune possible. Individual acts of rebellion could be contained, punished, forgotten. What he didn't understand was that Amélia's story had already escaped containment, spreading like wildfire through communities that had learned to preserve truth in songs and stories, in whispered conversations and coded messages. Her legacy lived on in every successful escape, every act of resistance, every moment when enslaved people chose dignity over survival. By 1850, the Underground Railroad had become a sophisticated network that moved thousands of people toward freedom each year. Many of its routes passed through Louisiana, following paths that Amélia had mapped in her mind and documented in her secret journal. Her knowledge, preserved and transmitted by people like Sarah Freeman, had become a weapon against the system that had killed her. The Civil War, when it came, would validate everything Amélia had died believing. That love was stronger than oppression, that sacrifice could inspire transformation, that individual choices could change the course of history. The enslaved people who fought for their freedom carried her story with them, a reminder that courage could be found in the most unlikely places. In 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation freed millions from bondage, Sarah Freeman stood in a Philadelphia church and thought about her grandmother's words. Love ain't never something to be sorry for, even when it costs everything. Amélia had been right. Love, for family, for community, for justice itself, had proven stronger than the forces that tried to destroy it. Her impossible romance with Nathaniel Burke had ended in tragedy, but it had also planted seeds of resistance that bloomed into freedom for countless others. The Red River still flowed past the ruins of Belafonte Plantation, carrying away the remnants of a system built on human bondage. But it also carried something else, the memory of a woman who'd loved impossibly, chosen courageously, and died protecting what mattered most. Some stories, Sarah knew, were too powerful to die. Some kinds of love were truly eternal. And some sacrifices echoed through generations, inspiring others to choose hope over despair, resistance over submission, love over fear. Amélia's legacy lived on in every person who chose freedom over safety, every family that stayed together against impossible odds, every community that preserved its dignity in the face of dehumanization. Her story had become part of the larger story of survival and resistance, of love's power to transcend even the most brutal systems of oppression. The slave who'd killed her overseer in a Louisiana grain cellar had become a symbol of something larger than herself, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit could not be broken. Her love story, impossible and tragic and ultimately triumphant, would be remembered long after the plantation system that had shaped it crumbled into dust. In the end, Amélia had been right about everything that mattered. Love was worth dying for. Some choices could only be made once. And sometimes the greatest act of love was also the greatest crime. But she'd also discovered something else, that love, once given freely, could never truly be destroyed. It lived on in the people who remembered, the stories that survived, the courage that passed from one generation to the next. The arrangement was over. The reckoning was complete, but the love, impossible, dangerous, eternal, would continue.